Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Hey, Thriving Farmers. Welcome to this episode of the Thriving Farmer Podcast. In this episode, I interview Tim Clymer, who is from Threefold Farm in Pennsylvania. Now, Tim started farming 6-7 years ago, full-time, as he was transitioning from a background of software engineering to farming and wanted to dive into small and large fruit. So they do a couple acres of orchard and pawpaws and figs and brambles and such like that. So we talk about getting started in farming. We talk about in detail his climate battery greenhouses. And so he'll explain exactly what those are in the episode, but they are basically naturally powered. Well, you do use some fans, some electricity, but using the Earth's heat capacity to store energy from the sun for the times when it's cold. So again, we go in detail into those of how he built those, the economics of them. We talk about how they use those to heat the figs and be able to produce those. And then we also just talk about the challenges of starting up a brand new farm, how they organize their farm, manage their farm, his lessons, his favorite tools on the farm. So join me in welcoming Tim to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Tim. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor just to be able to be here. We really appreciate what you're doing through the podcast and really the resource you're creating by offering it up.
Well, thank you. So give us a little bit of an overview of your farming operation. You have a few different things going on.
Yeah, we sure do. So my wife, Katherine, and I, along with our assistant farm manager, Sarah, run Threefold Farm. And Threefold Farm's a first-generation orchard here in beautiful kind of south central PA, the Susquehanna Valley, kind of closest to Harrisburg. And we specialize in unusual fruits. So things like pawpaws, figs, kiwi berries, Asian persimmons. And since we're not in a subtropical climate, we grow the majority of those figs in our 2 climate battery greenhouses. So that's about 6,000 square feet under cover, along with some tomatoes.
Very cool. All right. So then those crops are sold at farmers markets, or how do you sell those crops?
Yeah. In addition to that, we do grow some brambles as well. We offer those for U-Pick.
Okay.
Do a little bit of retail here on the farm, and then offer wholesale to restaurants and a local food hub. So we're probably about 60% wholesale and 40% retail, and that retail is divided up between the farm stand and our U-Pick operation.
And so do you also do the nursery? So do you sell cuttings and stuff from the pawpaws and the figs?
Yeah, we do operate a small scale nursery on the side, and that helps us propagate much of the planting stock that we use. So figs are kind of a weird animal, and persimmons to some degree too, in that there's a lot of varieties sort of in the trade that aren't available otherwise. And so you're left either contracting out and have someone propagate them or propagating them yourself. So we turn that into a little bit of a side business, in that we sell cuttings and we sell plants here on the farm.
So talk to me about your background. What did you do before you got started farming?
Good question. So farming, I laugh because farming would have been kind of the last thing I would imagine myself doing if you talked to me even 15 years ago. I didn't grow up in farming, but my family grew a lot of their own food, and I sort of begrudgingly helped them. So I remember as a kid picking green beans out beside my parents and not really enjoying it. But we got married, and my wife and I had moved to Texas. And so my sister-in-law had gifted me a few fruit trees. She likely didn't know what to get me for my birthday, but it ended up being a kind of fortuitous gift because my background is in software development.
Okay.
And so I don't know that brings a lot to the farming world, except that you have to, in that field, learn just constantly and try to absorb a lot. So I really threw myself into the orchard world, and try to just soak in as much as I could from as many sources as I could. And so, yeah, there was a growing passion for my wife and I. My wife more on the animal side of things. We don't do a lot of things commercially with the animals, maybe beside goat yoga. But and for me, the orchard. And so this idea of starting our own farm, we were doing it on the side more as a hobby, started to form in our minds, and it was just this idea that wouldn't go away. So eventually I left that career in software development, and as weird as it might sound, we honestly just felt called to start a farm here. So I left my job in the software development world, worked as an intern a commercial orchard for a full growing season. Then we ended up purchasing some land around the end of 2014. 2015 planted orchard. It was an old corn soybean field, and it had been several things before that. So cover cropped it in 2015 and planted out our first plants in 2016. That would be our brambles and our kiwi berries. And then every year from there, we've planted out about an acre of fruit trees.
Wow. So how many acres then are you in production right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in full production, probably 2 to 3 acres. Some things are sort of phasing in. It's hard to tell with an orchard because things are still growing in. The property is about 13 acres. About probably 6 to 7 of it we could have in production, but we also have a meadow planted down the center of the orchard for pest control, or pest just to up our beneficial populations. And then we have the perimeter of our orchard fenced in for our goats, and they kind of keep the woods and the fence rows from encroaching on the property. So it's a mixed use, but probably eventually about 6 acres in production.
Gotcha. All right, so let's dive into a little bit. You said you did a 1-year internship or apprenticeship. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was at McLeaf's Orchard. So the county south of here includes Gettysburg, and your listeners are probably familiar with Gettysburg. And that's kind of the orchard belt of Pennsylvania. So it's one of the top, I think, 5 apple producing regions in the country. And they grow a lot of stone fruits down there as well. And so I knew getting into this, one way to test out whether this was really for us, because some things that are passions are better off staying as passions or hobbies rather than an actual vocation. My wife and I discussed it, and we knew one way to kind of test that out was just to try it for a year and see if it was better off staying as a hobby. So I ended up working down there starting in about February, March, when you're just doing seeds starting. It was a fairly large operation with probably 100 plus acres divided up between processing apples, fresh market apples, at least one processor, at least one packer down there. But then the orchard I worked for did a lot of markets down in the Washington, D.C. area. Yeah. So it was kind of a mixed operation. I think at this point they were up to 5+ acres of vegetables, conventional farm, but learned a whole lot there just about growing at scale, because my knowledge up to that point was mostly backyard orchard and sort of book knowledge. So it's really important to be able to see that, how that worked at scale.
Yeah. Would you recommend doing an internship or apprentice for anyone deciding that they want to get started with farming? Do you think that was a great way for you to go?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's almost essential that you get an idea of, if you didn't grow up, especially in the orcharding world or the farming world, it's a great way to get some experience under your belt on kind of someone else's dime, and hopefully you're getting paid for it too.
Yeah, very cool. So what now does a typical day look like for you on the farm?
So yeah, that varies a lot seasonally. A typical day during our growing season, we start out with a morning meeting, kind of an assessment of what we're up against for the day in terms of what crops are coming in and out of season. Then we send our crew out to do harvest or whatever other seasonal duties there are on the farm. As I mentioned, we have 1 year-round employee, and then we hire a couple farm hands in the summer. And so a lot of that day-to-day during the summer involves harvesting fruit, but then also kind of maintaining our plantings throughout the summer growing season, really year round, but a lot of that work happens in the summer growing season.
Yeah. One of the things I've looked at orchards, and I've always looked at either they herbicide beneath the trees, or that is to manage the grass, because grass brings rodents and rodents girdle trees. Is that correct? Or
partially, I think it's part of that. Yeah. A heavy cover can provide cover for rodents and other things that can do damage to your trees. I think it's also the same reason you would kind of do it with vegetables as well, as to provide some kind of non-competitive space for your plants to grow. A lot of fruit trees, especially maybe dwarfed apples and things like that, don't have super extensive root systems, and they don't do well with a lot of competition. And so either spraying down or cultivating or doing something to provide that non-competitive space for the tree to get a head start. I know there's some different thoughts on that, and kind of messy management versus clean management of orchard rows, but I think that's the main set of ideas.
Yeah. Now, can you also like mulch with wood chips, or is that just a lot of work?
That's a whole lot of work. I've seen an orchard do it. The big question I had then to them was, how do you manage? So wood chips are a great low fertility environment for weed seeds to take off. Weed seeds love low fertility environments. And then so how do you manage the foxtail and stuff that's going to love that medium?
Yes.
And so the orchard I talked to did apply, I think, a once a year herbicide. You have to do something, especially in the Northeast. Something is going to grow if you leave that ground bare. So yeah, wood chips can be a good option. Some folks will stay away from it again, as they feel like it provides a habitat for voles and other things to tunnel into. We end up using a lot of woven black plastic. In our operation, which for some people have swear that provides habitat too, because it is cover. So whether it's our population of hawks or farm cats or whatever, we don't seem to, knock on wood, we don't seem to have that issue on our farm. And I don't like the idea of using woven black plastic, but I don't see another real viable option at this point other than hiring someone to just constantly weed or cultivate 24/7.
Yeah. I mean,
until they have magical robots that do it for us. I just don't.
Which are coming sooner than I think we think.
Yeah, maybe.
So that's really interesting because, obviously I feel the better option, I think you agree, is that the woven ground cloth is better than, spraying a Roundup a couple times a year.
Sure, and it's better than the real thin plastic. That's good for about one growing season. We've seemed to get at our older orchard, we have plastic that's going on 6-7 years, and it still looks pretty good as long as you fasten it down properly. So now disposal will eventually be an issue, and I don't like that. So if there was some other option, I would jump on it, but it has to tick a lot of boxes for me.
All right, let's dive into the climate battery greenhouses, because that is something I've talked a lot to David Greenberg out of Nova Scotia.
About the Acres, yeah.
Yeah, so he's really into it. And then he recommended I talk to you. And so I started geeking out on your site with all the studies and stuff. So let's dive into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
So talk to us how you got started with greenhouses.
Yeah, so back before we even started the farm, I'd gotten really into figs, and I was looking for a way to reliably overwinter figs in our area. And there's lots of ways you can do that. But on a large scale, how do you do it short of wrapping them or burying them or going to extreme measures to do it? Something that was less energy intensive, burn fewer or no fossil fuels in order to do it. And so my initial thought, sort of uneducated me, was to overwinter figs, just using high tunnels. I thought, high tunnels will do the trick. They keep it warmer than the outside. But the more I read about high tunnels, the more I realized that even if you have, let's say, half decent insulation, double inflated poly with a IR coating, on the inside layer, there are studies out there that show that doesn't really stay all that warmer than the outside temperatures, especially in January when you have these 16-hour plus nights and 4 hours of solar gain during the day. You're really working, and you're working, I think a good greenhouse is maybe R1 to R3 in terms of insulation. I could be wrong there, but it's almost nothing. And so I realized that wasn't going to work. And, let's say that by some miracle, I do get through January, the worst of the cold weather, and the figs by some chance do make it, and we get a really nice warm spell like we're prone to do in February or March, and the greenhouse heats up great, and we get hot nights enough to wake them up. Well, then we got to provide them supplemental heat to get through those remaining cold nights. We got to treat them like we would tomatoes, where they can't really stand a frost. So long story short, and that is a long story, I guess, the eventual solution ended up being our climate battery greenhouses.
And where did you first hear about them?
So maybe I should define what a climate battery greenhouse is for those who for those who aren't familiar with the terminology. A climate battery greenhouse goes by a couple different names or acronyms. If you're looking around out there, you may hear it called GAT, ground to air heat transfer, or SHCS, subterranean heating and cooling system. You might see earth tubes. They're all names that denote somewhat of the same idea or concept. And that is a greenhouse that actively manages or utilizes the thermal mass of the earth for the purposes of heating and cooling. So in the system, the soil functions like a big thermal battery that charges up on sunny days, and then you discharge it on cold nights. And so in some ways, it ends up at least partially solving one of the primary issues with greenhouses. Michael, as you know, greenhouses and high tunnels for most of the year generate way more heat than they can effectively use. And wouldn't it be nice to be able to pump that, or to save that heat, to store that heat, and be able to use it when you need it? So if you get a nice sunny day in late February where the sun's gaining some decent strength, say a big cold front's blown in from Canada and cleared out all the clouds, you might get to 90, 100 degrees, over 100 degrees in there. And if you have greens or something else in there, you got to get that heat out of there. But wouldn't it be nice if you could somehow store that heat for that night when you know the temperatures are going to drop back into the teens or single digits?
Yeah.
And so that's what our 2 climate battery greenhouses attempt to do, is to actively manage the thermal mass of the earth underneath the greenhouse in order to heat and at least partially cool the structure. And the only really moving part there is fans to push the air underground and interface with the soil. So getting back to your question, where we heard about it a number of years ago, I think I read it in an article in NAFEX, North American Fruit Explorers, about this guy out in Nebraska, Russ Finch. He does citrus in the snow, and he was growing citrus in his region in like a 4A climate, drawing heat underground, 8 feet underground from outside his greenhouse. He had a partially a submerged greenhouse, 4 feet sunk in the ground in his purpose-built structure, and it's worked for quite a number of years. So that piqued my interest. I found some guys out in Colorado who were doing similar things, but instead of using the heat outside the greenhouse, they were using the inside soil thermal mass and using that for heat. So they were growing tropical plants in very non-tropical Colorado and only using backup heat on the coldest of nights. And so eventually we decided we wanted to do something similar, but most of the designs we saw out there involved very purpose-built structures, kind of pieced together structures, very heavily insulated north walls. These weren't these off-the-shelf kits that you can buy. These were highly insulated for greenhouse structures. And what that meant is that the cost per square foot is really relatively high compared to a conventional high tunnel structure. So we wanted to see if we could do something that took the structure of a high tunnel and stuck a climate battery underneath and would still work without having one of these purpose-built deals. And so in 2017, we ended up taking the leap, putting in our first climate battery greenhouse, which is just a 30 by 96 conventional sort of quote unquote off the shelf type frame Gothic structure, and put it over a series of buried piping in the ground. Yeah, so what that means is that we're able to turn our sort of 6B climate into something like 8A or I'm sorry, an 8B or 9A type climate, and we don't use any supplemental heat from fossil fuels. So our figs leaf out in about early March, and then don't go to sleep again until about early to mid-December, sometimes up to early January, depending on how.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, so then you built a second one.
We did. Same idea. I took some of the lessons learned from the first one and some of the pain points involved in building the first one and tried to come up with a second design. And the problem with designs of these systems is they're still in their infancy at this point. They're still mostly pragmatic. And so you lay out this amount of piping and you attach these types of fans, mostly because that's what's worked in the past. And that's not a bad way to operate at first, but we also wanted to be more scientific about it. So eventually we ended up partnering with Penn State, and we're trying to get a better grasp on how we build these things. But yeah, second one went in, and it's more or less equivalent to the first one in terms of performance, but we're still capturing data there and figuring it out.
All right, so let's talk about the figs. You grow the figs in there. What other crops are you growing in those tunnels?
Yeah, so we have the 2 tunnels. About 1.5 of them are devoted to figs. So our first one we call the gray house is all figs at this point, and they're getting to maturity with just kind of 2 years in the ground. We just planted out figs in the other one this year, so they're experiencing their first winter in there, and so far so good. And then half of that tunnel then is devoted to solanaceous crops. So things like peppers and tomatoes and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So talk to me about the differences between the two, because I know you did a study with Penn State and you're working on just the different airflow, making the air turbulent versus just straight through. Talk to us about kind of what were the lessons you learned before you built the second one, and then obviously there's probably lessons that you will be changed from even the second one now.
Sure. So we brought Penn State on board actually as we were just finishing up the second one. We had learned some lessons in installing the first one, and that was the primary motivator behind a second design. And I wanted just to see if we could get the install down and have that be a lot easier. And so we brought them on in the fall of 2018, just as we were finishing up the second house, the blue house. And their primary task was to try to get their minds around and their hands around actually quantifying the amount of heat that the system was producing. So not just it makes it 10 to 25 degrees warmer, but what is it actually outputting in terms of BTUs? So because if you can do that, then you can say, well, if I was running this against a propane, a 60K BTU propane heater, what are my operating costs, apples to apples comparison? And so I think we got a pretty good handle on that the previous year. And then this year's group is taking that same information. The 2018-2019 group installed a bunch of sensors, both in the ground and throughout the greenhouses, to try to get a handle on that. And so this year's group is tasked with, so now we know how much this is outputting. How do we make the system better? How do we optimize airflow? How do we more effectively interface with the soils? Because that's what it ends up coming down to, is you're pumping hot air from the greenhouse underground. How do you effectively distribute that air so that it interfaces with the ground and the ground absorbs as much as it can?
Gotcha. And then, so the pipes underneath you're using, they're just standard drainage tile pipes, correct?
Yep, just standard drainage tile. We buy 250-foot rolls of drainage tile, corrugated, perforated drain tile with a sock on it as kind of extra, as a way to just ensure that no silt particles get in there. And then, we use kind of off-the-shelf components. For the first one, we used large corrugated pipe, the type you would use for drain culverts, as our manifolds and our risers. And then for the blue house, we used a majority of kind of 6-inch drain waste and vent pipe. So a lot of off-the-shelf components. And then in terms of moving parts, the only moving parts are the fans, which consist of either kind of overpowered horizontal airflow fans, the 3rd horsepower, 300-watt types, or the duct fans. So 6-inch duct fans that push air around and have a little more maybe oomph to them. Yep. Okay,
because I've seen some of there's companies out there that sell these systems, and they have these massive $500 fans. And so you actually never even went down that road. You just used off-the-shelf parts.
Sure. Yeah. So you can go down that road, and I'm sure those fans are fairly efficient. But at some point, at some size, we tried to stay with kind of readily available sizes of piping and fans, because if you can get the thing that a whole bunch of people are buying, it tends to be a lot cheaper.
Yes.
So if you look at some of the vent fans that they're using and some of these other designs, they're talking about 20-inch duct fans, which are kind of special, very special purpose, and therefore very expensive. So we try to stay away from that.
Yeah, and hard to replace if something goes wrong, and you don't want to keep one on inventory because that's capital tied up. So
sure.
Yeah, anyway, well, that's good to know. So let's talk about the costs associated with investing in a climate battery, because obviously you have to do a ton of excavation. Then you've got the cost of the piping, the fans. But other than that, there's not a lot of costs, correct?
So the upfront cost is the major cost. And so if you can get operating costs then down to a point where it's significantly below any comparable fossil fuels, then I think it makes economic sense. So we did a tally of cost per square foot, because that's something we're used to working with in greenhouses, and we came up with around $4 per square foot. So that would include things like the excavation, the tubing, the fans, the thermostats. We don't include labor in that to, assemble all the pieces, the big Lego kind of system that you're putting
Yeah.
together there, and then installing the system. So excavation's in there, but any labor that on the farm that you need if you're going to be doing the installation. And then the cost to run electrical wiring. You're probably going to be running some wiring to the structure anyways. And so that's a little harder to figure in, but around $4 per square foot, which is, if you buy a high tunnel with some of the bells and whistles, that might be around the range that you're running, depending on where you are in the country.
All right. So then you're spending, for let's say a 30 by 96, you're spending about $12,000 without the install labor.
Correct. And then, and we've done some estimates to show that we try to kind of play it out in a worst case scenario operating costs. And we estimate with running our fig house that we also grow some tomatoes in, we're spending about $400 a year in electric costs to run the system, which
that's not much at all.
No, yeah. So it's about as much. I wanted to compare it because we run horizontal airflow fans in our house, 4 of them, 24/7, 365, and it about matches that cost. So it's kind of like doubling your horizontal airflow fans.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I mean, obviously then the next step is to kind of look at comparable that to fossil fuels. And I remember when we were running our greenhouses, sometimes we were running $400 a week or more in just propane to keep that thing warm.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. If we estimate that our system outputs, somewhere between 60 and 120,000 BTUs, depending on, the application, the differentials between inside and outside, it's costing us about 16.5 cents an hour to operate the system. So our cost per million BTUs is, let's say, $1.50 to $3.
If you've been enjoying this episode so far, you're going to want to head over to growingfarmers.com/free resources and download our free resource bundle to help you shave hours off your week and become a thriving farmer. It includes resources such as our 10 winter growing secrets we wish we knew when we started, which is a ebook which talks about the tips and techniques to get better growth in your winter production. We teach things like the simple but counterintuitive principle that trips up most beginning growers, the shape and size of tunnels that are best for winter production, how to prepare beds so they are weed-free and get beautiful, lush stands of crops, what to do about pests like aphids, voles, and slugs, how to fast-track your research to fine-tune your production for your microclimate, and how to pack in more crops for higher yields and profits. So head over to growingfarmers.com/free resources and download your free resource bundle today. Okay, $1.50 to $3 per million BTUs. Now that's a good number to know.
It is a good number to know.
Gotcha. So now one of the things too is the two designs you built from the first to the second were radically different. And if people haven't, you should go to your website has a lot of resources on this. They've got the studies and all that data. So tell us your website so they can go there and check that out.
Sure. So if you head to threefoldfarm.org or just threefold.farm if you want to use the fancy domain. Yeah, we try to be real open-handed with the information. We're not in the business of selling these systems. I do offer some consulting and try to relate the lessons I've learned, but we want to be real honest and upfront and say, hey, if this makes sense in your context, maybe it's worth something. Maybe it's worth exploring. I don't think a system like this would work for growing, let's say, year-round tomatoes in our climate. It just can't produce that caliber of heat. But it's a really great way to transform your climate into something perhaps further south of you for very low input costs. Honestly, it wouldn't be economically possible to grow figs in our climate, or we'd have a much, much smaller margin on the figs that we grow if we had to use propane or natural gas to heat those houses. And then there's electric cost of running those systems too. So even the little fan that kicks, or not the little fan, the air distribution fan on some of those furnaces I've looked, and it runs about 800 watts, which is not all that different from the fans that we're running to operate the system. So
wow. Yeah, so that's really good to know. So yeah, back to the two different systems you put in place. Is the second one significantly better? It looks like it was easier to install.
Definitely easier to install, and that's a big factor when installing one of these systems. Unless you have access on farm to excavation equipment, which some farms do, And that's a huge added benefit. I think you can probably knock off 50, 60% of the cost if you can do the excavation yourself. Not that your time's free, but it's expensive to bring in an excavator. It's definitely a lot easier to install. Working with our excavator, he was able to excavate us out to 6 feet and then backfill into 3 feet. And we were able to assemble and install kind of each distinct layer in that new house within probably an afternoon or a half a day type of thing. Whereas the first system, it was a lot of hurry up and wait type of stuff. So both systems are comparable in performance. The first house is probably a little more efficient, can keep things a little warmer than the other one, but not so much that it would make a huge difference for figs.
Gotcha. What are the hidden benefits of the system? Because I know sometimes you install something, you're like, oh, that's nicer, or actually annoyances too.
Yeah, sure. So it does do some cooling. When you're running the system, you do pay for that cooling, but it's not so much different perhaps than maybe a vent fan in terms of electrical cost. There is some dehumidification, we think, happening during cooling mode. So that hot, humid air that you're pushing underground, if it reaches its condensation point and the condensate drops out, you'll get some dehumidification happening. We see the houses, the houses naturally in the winter are a little drier, but on those hot sunny days, we do seem to see some of that happening. One big thing, I think, is the soil being pre-warmed in the spring. So pushing that nice hot air underground and not just getting the air temperatures right, but getting the soil temperatures and amping those up a little bit.
Yeah. Because the thing is, let's say from January and especially February on, your air and the light and the day length is so much longer. So you're pumping heat into that greenhouse, but usually you can't grab that heat for the night. And so being able to then just dump that hot air that's accumulating underground really does a wonderful job of pushing that ground temperature earlier.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of downsides, the system's fairly low maintenance. I go in there and I'm trying to simulate more of a southern climate. So going into the fall, I'll slowly step down the temperature, slower than temperature wants to step down outside. And so I'll adjust that with our thermostats. We have one for heating and one for cooling. And actually in the blue house, one of them they both do double duty. And so as the soil temperatures fall, I'm stepping down that temperature, both the high and the low set points, and then I'm ramping it up again in spring, trying to simulate more of a southern season. So the tubing does take up a little bit of space in the greenhouse. I think I've calculated it like 1% to 2% of your total greenhouse space. We still utilize it, especially in the gray house where the tubing doesn't stick out too far above the ground. We can still grow figs kind of above that tubing. So it's not totally lost. If you're planting one, certainly plan it where the tubes aren't going to come out in your pathways. So they're not in the middle of a walkway. There's some, so just simple logistical stuff like that you may not think of. Yeah. We certainly didn't think of at first. Yeah.
But actually to that point, how far do the pipes come out of the ground, or how far do they need to come out of the ground?
That's something that's up for debate, I guess. So in the gray house, in a lot of the commercial designs, you'll see they're pulling air from kind of the apex of the greenhouse and to grab the very warmest air. But if you think of the air in the greenhouse as a total volume that's at some particular temperature, eventually all the air is going to cycle through that piping anyways. So I can see some benefit, maybe. The physics might say otherwise. So in our gray house, all of our tubing is kind of at most waist high. In our blue house, the tubing sits up a little higher. So it may depend on your context too, and what makes sense for the particular crop you're trying to grow.
Yeah, I guess if you had, not to get on the side track here, but if you had good HAV fans, then you could almost cut it off at ground level, put those pipes right in your pathways and just put a grate over them and have them as part of your pathways.
Oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
Anyway, I don't know.
It'd be nice. You might have employees hanging out there, especially when it's in cooling mode. Oh man, I can't tell you the number of times I stick my shirt over one of those things when it's blazingly hot in there.
Yes. Well, I guess that's one of the hidden benefits then.
Yeah, that's a hidden perk. There were some concerns. I've heard concerns from folks. They seem to be unfounded about mold forming in the pipes and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that could happen if you didn't have perforated piping, or if
Mm-hmm.
you had a place where water could end up and just sit there and stagnate. But
Yeah.
I really haven't seen that, and I haven't heard any reports of that happening,
Hmm.
because most of the condensate just drops out into the surrounding soil.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. All right. Anything else about the climate batteries you want to share before we kind of move on?
So stay tuned to our website. I hate to plug something, but we plan on, we are open-handed with what we discover about these, that we're not at the point of commercializing any of this just yet. So we'd love more people to give them a try and
Mm-hmm.
contact us if you're interested in it. But we will publish when Penn State, the students from Penn State give us their updated design. We'll put that out for everyone to see online, and hopefully we can keep this moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'll, if people are on our email list, when that kind of stuff comes up, that's the kind of stuff that we love to share. So we'll make sure that we help you guys disseminate that out there.
Very cool.
All right. So let's go back to the farm a bit. Kind of like time management, now you've been in this for a number of years now, and it's more of a maturing business. There are always endless tasks to be done. How do you make sure that you focus on the right things every day?
Yeah, isn't that the question? So we have a whiteboard, and we're new at this, right? So we're 5 to 6 years in, and so I don't pretend that we're a mature farmer still figuring out things year by year. But we have a whiteboard in our packing shed that outlines the priorities for the day and for the week. And our assistant farm manager Sarah does a great job of keeping that up to date. And we'll get together at least once a week and talk through the different areas of the orchard and determine what needs attention. And some of those kind of come intuitively and are obvious, but just need to be put down on the board so our seasonal employees know what to do. And then I think we'll eventually work on a little more of a calendar system or a seasonal system so that we have an idea of, week by week, season by season, just as things don't slip through the cracks. What do we need to do with each of our crops? How do we treat each one throughout the growing season? So things like growing the figs in the greenhouses, we're still throwing around ideas for workflows for them because we're still relatively in our infancy, and we're trying to figure out, what stage they're growing at, when the fruit's going to be ripening, what we need to be doing in terms of paying attention to them, or whether we can just let them go and do their own thing.
So kind of like a master calendar for each crop, like, okay, June 15th, normally this time of year we've done X, Y, and Z, or we should be thinking about that. Please check the fig crop for these things. Yeah,
exactly. Or based on, any pest issues we saw in previous years. Let's keep an eye out from this point on for this. Or when we need to trellis things. Yeah, there's a multitude of concerns that a calendar I think would help with.
Yeah. So the other thing about figs is, do you have to prune those every single year?
We do. Our outside ones get pruned by Mother Nature, so they typically, unless we have a really odd winter, maybe one winter out of 5 or so, we get a winter where they make it through relatively unscathed. But yeah, we're pruning them, letting Mother Nature prune them, and then they shoot back up from the ground. And figs will fruit on new wood. So we're thankful for that. They love our summers and dislike our winters. So we're pruning them outside, and we're also pruning them inside. We use a method of pruning called Japanese Espalier or Japanese fig Espalier, which we've gleaned from whatever literature we can find in Japanese and videos, where they keep the figs trained low to the ground. So they have a set of limbs that are parallel to the ground at about knee high. And since figs fruit on new wood, they develop these real heavy woody stems, and you prune them back to stubs every year, maybe similar-ish to grapes. And then they shoot vertical wood, and each of those verticals can have maybe upwards of 20 figs on them. But then they're grown somewhat like tomatoes, and that we space our verticals about every foot along the row. At least that's the current habit.
Gotcha. That's fascinating.
But that keeps them. Figs want to be trees, and so to work in a greenhouse and to avoid working in the peak of the greenhouse and avoid ladder work, we need to keep them low. And so this was the way we thought we could keep them relatively tame and avoid picking from true trees.
Absolutely. Very cool. What is the hardest thing you've ever done as a farmer?
Oof, gosh. Every year there's a new challenge. So 2017, it was just being open. This is our first business my wife and I have operated. So it's just being open for business for the first time and navigating all those kind of ins and outs of owning a business. 2018 was, I don't know if you experienced this, most of New England did, but just a very wet, rainy year. And that can wreak havoc on fruit. And really into the next year, we had a really nice 2019 weather-wise, but some of the challenges in 2018 were due to the weather in 2018. 2019 seemed to be the year of, maybe we're just hitting that sweet spot in terms of years, but focusing in on profitability and sustainability of the enterprise. Because we're dealing with fruits that it's somewhat tricky to come up with budgets for them and harvest estimates and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to get a better feel, I think, for what each crop looks like to bring its kind of literal fruition in terms of labor and resources and flow throughout the seasons. So profitability of individual crops is what we've really focused in on in 2019.
Yeah, that is one of the important things, because you look at like some of these wider orchards that have like 5, 6, 8, even 10 different enterprises embedded. And you're like, actually, what does make money? And way too often, it's the cider donuts.
Yeah, right. And it's critically important to be able to assess. Some things are going to be loss leaders, and maybe you have to live with that in order to enable other parts of your business. But if you're not making money on something, gosh, you have to give a good, long, hard look at it. See, is it really worth it?
Absolutely. So who would you say your mentors have been over the years? I know you mentioned the farm you apprenticed at, but talk to us a little bit about kind of who you've learned from and who've helped build your business to where it is today.
Maybe it's cliche, but my parents were really helpful in instilling so much in us, and just from a good work ethic to how they treat and love others, and I'm still learning that, and hopefully getting a little better each year. And then in the organic orchard world, Dr. Jim Travis, Penn State University, and he ran Travis Organics, which was raised organic apples and peaches, really helped and is still helping to form my mind around growing fruit organically. We live in like a really tough region to grow organic fruit. We have a lot going for us in terms of natural rainfall and sunshine in the summer, but especially for pome fruits like apples and pears and then stone fruits, it's extremely difficult. There's a lot that likes, there's a lot other than us that likes those fruit. And Jim was, and really is instrumental in helping me navigate my orchard that way. And then, just organizations like PASA, Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. They have an awesome conference in early February that I've learned a lot from, and just networking opportunities there. And, I don't know, I could mention a ton of others who have helped me think, differently, not just in the orchard world, but otherwise.
Absolutely. Very cool. Yeah, we'll put some of those names in the show notes so people can access them easily.
Great.
So let's talk a little bit about the business side now. If there was, let's say, a magic reset button related to starting your farm, what systems would you go back and put into place sooner rather than later?
Yeah. Gosh, every year we learn a little bit more. So in some ways, I'm kind of thankful for the mistakes that I have made. I don't know that I would have learned. I think I'm hard-headed enough that I wouldn't have learned any other way other than to make them myself, but they're costly. This year with that focus being on finances, it could be just what my brain's around right now, but I certainly would have focused on the business end of the farm sooner. And I wish I had, in some ways, I wish I had a business minor or had that sort of drilled into me from the onset. It's not kind of the glamorous side of things. And I don't think anybody gets into this because they just love business. Maybe some people do, but they usually get into it because they love growing and they love, caring for the land and things like that. But the business thing has to go hand in hand with that. And it's somewhat difficult to do that with unusual fruits because there are quite a few unknowns, but I still think it would have been valuable to spend more time up front thinking and planning more critically around that. And I think there is a new tool coming out around that called, I don't know if you're familiar with the Veggie Compass, or there's also the Fruit and Nut Compass.
Yes,
I think
I've heard of them.
Sponsored by a SARE project. Yeah, so the Veggie Compass helps growers get their mind around all the costs involved with producing vegetables. And I think the Fruit and Nut Compass will help people do that with perennial crops, because that's, notoriously difficult. You have all this big cash outlay, you have big equipment expenses, and how does that pay for it? And does it pay for itself over time, over a 10, 15-year outlook, and give people a realistic picture of cash flow and things like that.
Very cool. We'll definitely put that in the show notes as well. So you farm with your wife and a farm manager. Talk to us a little bit about hiring. How did you find the people you have on your farm, and how do you find, because I know you're also hiring yearly, so how are you making those decisions every single year?
Yeah, we hire primarily from a local college around here, Messiah College. They have a really nice sustainability program, and we've developed a relationship with them. And so we usually end up hiring at least one person out of there. Part of our focus as a farm is to kind of teach, our threefold purpose is to teach what little we've learned and pass it on to others. And we love that, to bring students, college students in on that. And so that's worked out really well for us. Those kids have kids have a great work ethic. And then Sarah, our farm manager, came to us kind of by providence. She was up at the farm school up in northern Mass, and had heard about our farm from 3 different people. And so she eventually decided, maybe I need to contact them. So she sent us an email and said, hey, I'd like to tour your farm. I'm going to be here on break. So when she did, we talked to her about an opportunity that we thought we would have coming up in the fall. And it turns out she was able to start around the same time that one of our kind of farmhands was finishing up. So it really worked out well, and to have that continuity from year to year, to not have to fully kind of retrain people. So as much as we like to teach, it's really difficult to not have a continuity of knowledge from growing season to growing season. So we're just beginning to see the benefits of that now.
Absolutely. So let's talk about your marketing. You said about 60% on the restaurants, and then about the 40% in the farm stand and you pick. How are you finding your restaurants? How are you developing those relationships?
Yeah, those relationships have been kind of forged over the years. We were lucky enough to get our foot in the door with a local chef who really enjoys working for or with local farmers, and the kind of ins and outs and the seasonal unpredictability of that. And so I would say that's kind of the best way. If you can get your foot in the door with one chef, and then typically kind of cold calling or cold approaching chefs won't necessarily work. The best thing that we've found that works, if you can get your foot in the door with one, is to get personal introductions to another one in the area, and just kind of expand your network that way. I think restaurants like that we have unique produce, so they're not seeing figs or pawpaws from anyone else. And so having something unique that kind of may get you in the door, may pique their interest, can help a whole lot.
And then that helps you sell the other crops you grow.
Yeah, exactly. Part of the reason why we grow tomatoes in the greenhouse is to kind of get our foot in the door at these restaurants somewhat early in the season. And so they get on that, maybe habit of buying from us. And they get introduced to our tomatoes before they get introduced to a lot of others.
And because so they know. You have the cheap growing from the Climate Battery that allows you to do them much earlier.
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of upfront costs in terms of propane there, but we're still able to offer them, I won't say as early as if we had heated with propane, but pretty darn early, especially for our area.
Very cool. So are you using social media at all to develop those at all, or how are you also reaching like the general population that comes to your stand?
Yeah, so for our retail customers, we use social media a decent amount. We were just talking in our strategic planning meeting that we need to make a better use of that. But we do reach out there, especially as new fruits come in season. It's a good way to introduce and say, hey, figs are finally in season, or pawpaws are finally coming, because we get a lot of calls throughout the summer saying, when are these things going to be available? And so making that available to the public and reminding people can be a great way. And it's cheap to free marketing. And we also keep a calendar on our website kind of to let people know kind of approximately when certain fruits will be available. Yeah. And so that can help to answer some of those questions ahead of time. But social media is certainly something we're hoping to do a better job of in the future, though we still employ it now.
Very cool. So let's talk about beginning farmers, because I know there's so many farmers now trying, get into the farming space now. What would you say the biggest mistake that you see beginning farmers making is?
I'll harp again on finances. So, realizing that your farm, as much as you like to grow and as much as you like to think things may just come together magically from a financial and marketing perspective, really knowing what it's going to, or have any idea of what it's going to take to produce that, pound of carrots or a half pint of figs, so that you know your costs and what you need to make in order to make a go of it, if you're going to be around for any amount of time. So, farming as a whole it's not like software development at this point. It's heavily industrialized. There's always going to be someone growing at 100 times your scale. And so it's difficult to impossible to compete at that scale. And in many ways, it becomes a race to the bottom. And so the big question that pings around in my mind is, how do you differentiate yourself so that you're attracted to the customer and can ask for the prices that make your business work? What makes your produce different, or what is the story that you're telling with your farm, and how is it different from the stuff they pick up at the grocery store? So, for us, part of that story is our growing practices. We're certainly not certified organic, but we try to grow as naturally as possible, and then unique produce that sets us apart. And I don't know that we always tell that story very well. But again, it's something that we're focused in on.
Absolutely. If you could pick one, what would be your favorite farming tool?
Am I allowed to?
You can, yes. I have multiple people say, I can't just pick one.
It's really hard to pick one. Okay, so my favorite actual tool is, I have these Okitsune, I'm probably butchering the name, hand pruners. So they'd be similar to like a pair of Felcos, but made out of Japan, and are fantastic. The steel's harder. They give a real nice, satisfying click. They're so sharp and hold an edge really well. And I'm going to be sacrilegious and say they're better than my Felco hand pruners. So that's a little sacrilege in the orchard world. But they're just really satisfying to use. The closing mechanism is nice. They don't gum up, it seems like, as much as some of the other ones. But yeah, other than that, I'm going to be, for my geeky answer, I'll say Google Sheets is fantastic. And I love the ability to just plug in numbers and see where the cards fall if I'm planning something out. Yeah, no, Google Sheets is just fabulous. We've done so much work from either calculating soil results, test results, to farm planning, to even like employee tracking, to everything. It's just so easy to have those on Sheets. And then we actually started using something called Airtable, which is basically Google Sheets on steroids. Yeah, if you want to geek out, I think you'd really, really enjoy that. Okay. I'll make a note and check that out. Yeah. So, all right. And where can people find out more about you and your work? You mentioned your website, and then you're on social media as well, if you just want to share those tags. Sure. So on Facebook, we are Threefold Farm, and at Threefold Farm on Instagram. And you can find us on the web at threefold.farm or threefoldfarm.org. We have all the information about the different crops we grow, the climate battery greenhouses, information on starting your own figs from cuttings, that sort of thing. Very cool. Well, Tim, thank you again so much for coming on today. I've been, geeking out about climate battery greenhouses and just in general orchard type crops. So it's always, again, I tell people this is a very selfish podcast. I interview who I want to. Hey, it's yours. You might as well do what you want there. And I'm hoping other people geek out with me too. So again, thanks again so much, Tim, and keep up the good work. And I'm hoping to come visit you sometime here when I get over to Pennsylvania way. Oh yeah, please do. We'd love to have you. Thank you, Michael.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.